Hi class, today let's talk about class relations and inequality. We live in a capitalist society, and our society is stratified from the top down, where we have those people at the very top who have or enjoy the majority of the privilege and power and resources in society, and also have networks to where they are able to connect with people with influence in various areas of society itself. Social stratification is a system that distributes wealth, that distributes a person's social position in society. We call statuses. That social position can be determined by ascription, that is by birth. For example, your sex, your race is determined at birth, or it can be determined by achievement, by your education, by your work ethic. All of those things can contribute to your status determined by achievement. When we look at class differences, we primarily examine income, wealth, a person's education, or occupational prestige. And that's why in sociology we prefer the term SES, or socioeconomic status, over class, because it is a more precise measurement of a person's position in society. In a class system, we have those who own property, they own corporations, they own technologies, and then we have those who sell their labor to this sort of corporate and corporate class of people who control the resources in society. The working classes of people make up the majority of people in our society. They're the ones who are actually actively involved in the production process. They work in the factories and companies and shops that create all the goods in our society and products in our society, and also perform the majority of services in our society. We live in a post-industrial society today where we do less manufacturing and we tend to be more service-oriented. So even though we have shifted in terms of the basic industries in our society, we still have this very rigid class structure where we have those at the top who are a very small minority of people who control the majority of the wealth in society, and then we have the overwhelming majority of people who work for them. We also have a managerial class. We have a class of people who serve the interests of those who own companies and factories and property, who have the privilege and power, and they are the managers. They are the ones that are in charge of the day-to-day operations of companies and factories. We also have the state. The state is represented by the legitimate legal authority, the government that regulates society, that sets the rules in terms of how the economy works. We have periods in our political system where we have a more conservative administration, and then we have less regulation, where companies are able to maximize their profits, and often at the expense of wages and jobs for the working classes of people. And then we have periods that tend to be more liberal in nature, where there are more regulations. This adds to the need for safety, safe working conditions and healthy working conditions, fair wages and benefits for the working class. Our society is inherently unequal. We have those who enjoy the privilege, power, and resources in society, and everything is skewed in the interests of that minority but dominant class of our society. And then we have those who enjoy most of the disadvantages in this society, who own little or nothing when it comes to our economy. So we have this inherent inequality in our society. That reality is unquestionable. The facts speak volumes, and we have evidence that there is this inequality in society. The difference is when it comes to explaining why it's that way. There are some people that attribute these inequalities to what's known as social psychological factors, that there are things within individuals and groups that determines their position in society. It is tied to things like IQ. There is this assumption that there's some people that lack the intelligence or lack the education that explains why they are members of the underclass, but also social psychological factors that explain why people are at the top of the socioeconomic ladder. It's because they have higher levels of intelligence, and this is the assumption of this social psychological approach to looking at inequality in society. On the other hand, we explain these inequalities by institutional factors, by the way in which our social institutions operate, and whether or not the masses of people have equal representation in like politics and have equal access to education and are able to participate in markets in the largest economy. So these institutional factors are another way of explaining why we have this inequality within society. There was a book written by Andrew Hacker called Two Nations, and he looked at the differences between those who are in the majority and those who are part of the minority class of people in society. That there are two nations whom there's no discourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets. Our class distinctions can be very rigid and very divisive in our societies, so much so that you have a very distinct difference in the worlds in which the masses of people live in, and those that live in gated communities, who live in the suburban areas of our society. And they speak different languages. They are, have different values and different beliefs. And this is what Andrew Hacker characterized, how he characterized the inequality in our society. It's like we have different worlds that people live in. What are the consequences of the economic inequalities in our society? It denies people of their rights. In this society, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there are some that have more rights than others. There's some that have more privileges than others. This inequality affects the quality of life. Some people do not have the ability to enjoy not only a higher quality of life, but the basic necessities of life that contributes to the poverty in our society. Around the world, poverty is life-threatening. In this world, it affects more of the quality of life of people in our society. It also affects the inequality in employment, that people do not have the opportunity to be employed or employable in jobs that have, for example, a working wage and that have benefits that are very vital to a family and an individual's survival in our society. This inequality also leads to educational inequalities. For example, there are people that are unable to have access to higher education, and it's because of the inability to afford a higher education. And finally, there's health care, and the consequences of health care are very significant among those who are members of the working and underclass within our society. What is the role of government in all of this? Well, we're divided in our society. There, on the one hand, conservatives believe that the government should have a limited role or no role in the way that wealth is distributed, the opportunities are provided within our society. And then on the other hand, there is a more liberal orientation that believes the government should have a very central role in ensuring equal opportunity and the distribution of opportunities and resources within our society. We have a society where the tax laws, for example, are skewed heavily in favor of those who are among the wealthy in our society, who pay disproportionately fewer taxes than those of, for example, the working class that have very few deductions when it comes to their resources, where there are many more resources for those who make in excess of $100,000 or more per year. So these inequalities in society have real consequences for people and society. We have various theories, we have various perspectives on why it's that way, but it's unquestionable that we have these inequalities in our society. As a social problem, the critical power conflict perspective looks at these differences from the standpoint of how class intersects with these economic inequalities and class differences in our society. It looks at how race plays a role and is a factor that explains these differences in our society and also has consequences for racial minorities and for women in society, people with disabilities, and for veterans. Historically, our society was based upon a more competitive capitalism where we had more of an opportunity to participate in markets and society. And more we have what's known as monopoly capitalism, where you have a very small group of corporations that control, for example, things like the auto industry. You can name the auto manufacturers almost on one hand and maybe use a few fingers on the other. You have a few airline companies that's monopolized the airline industry, a few high-tech companies that prevent competition, where you have an open market of competition both domestically and globally. The inequalities that we have in society are a significant problem, particularly along class lines, and they have consequences for people and society. And sociology attempts to explain why these inequalities exist and how we can recommend solutions to these problems and to ameliorate the consequences of class inequality in society.